Alright everyone, I want to thank you all so much for watching this video here as we drove US Route 34 through Rocky Mountain National Park, and then of course driving the very famous Trail Ridge Road here in the park as well. So my grandpa and I got up pretty early on this particular day of the trip. We actually got up earlier than any other previous day on the trip, including the first day that we got on the road, because we wanted to get into Rocky Mountain National Park before 9 a.m. to avoid the reservation system. Of course, I did buy a reservation in advance just in case we just so happened to get up later than we expected, and we just happened to cross through the Fall River entrance there a little bit after 9 a.m. just to be safe. But luckily when we got in the park here, it was very early in the morning and there was not a lot of people here despite it being a Friday, I believe, when we passed through the park. Actually, let me correct myself. I believe it was a Thursday when we were passing through Rocky Mountain National Park. But even though it wasn't quite the weekend yet, it was still amazing to pass through this park when it's not very busy, because this is definitely one of the busiest national parks in the United States, considering that most of the people that visit the park are during like the summer and fall months, because guess what? You cannot drive Trail Ridge Road through the winter and spring months because of how much snow is up here at this very high elevation. Of course, the elevation is probably the biggest attraction or the scariest part of Trail Ridge Road, depending on how you look at it when you drive this road right here, because there's no guardrails on this road, although this road is a lot less scary than some of the other roads with similar elevation in the state of Colorado. Driving up here in the Alpine Tundra is very cool and very unique, and Colorado is pretty much the only state here in the United States where you can just do it and it just seems pretty normal, because there's no other roads really that drive through the Alpine Tundra that much here in the United States. In fact, off the top of my head, there's only one other major road in the United States that even goes into the Alpine Tundra, and that is the infamous Beartooth Highway in Wyoming and Montana. Although the Alpine Tundra is quite a bit lower up there as you go farther north, because like I mentioned in the video, the farther north you go, the lower the Alpine Tundra gets in elevation, because what determines the Alpine Tundra is of course the weather and the temperature. I believe it's about 50 degrees during the warmest month of the year is the point where trees can no longer grow, and then it just so happens to be in Colorado that elevation is roughly 11 to 12,000 feet, depending whether you're in northern Colorado or southern Colorado. Of course, if you don't stay on the trails while you're up here in the Alpine Tundra and you just walk on the plants and everything like that up here in the Alpine Tundra, you could damage the ecosystem up here. So it's very important while you're up here at this elevation in the Alpine Tundra to stay on the trails, because it could take a very long time for the Alpine Tundra to return back to its natural state. This is one of the most fragile and harshest ecosystems in the entire world, but that doesn't make it any less beautiful. Of course, not having trees up here in this elevation, the views are just absolutely spectacular in every direction. And my grandpa and I were just lucky to be up here on a relatively clear day, and the views were just really awesome. And this was our first time up here in the fall, so it definitely was a little bit chilly, but if you're up here in the summertime, be sure to wear plenty of sunscreen and to stay hydrated, because the air is very thin up here and you can get dehydrated very easily. And then of course the sun up here is a lot more intense than it would be at lower elevations, so it's very easy to get sunburn up here at these elevations. So just be sure to take the proper precautions when you're coming up here in Trail Ridge Road during all times of the year. Rocky Mountain National Park was the only national park that my grandpa and I visited on our fall road trip here in Colorado and the Southwest. But man, Rocky Mountain National Park is certainly one of the most beautiful national parks that we have here in the United States. Of course, this was the last national park that we visited here in 2024 as well, after previously going to Pinnacles National Park, Yellowstone National Park, and Grand Teton National Park. And let me just say, that's quite an amazing list of national parks that we have been to this year. And Rocky Mountain is certainly one of the most beautiful ones, and this was my grandpa and I's third time visiting Rocky Mountain National Park after previously visiting it here in 2011 and 2014. And this was also our first time visiting it here in the fall as well, and it was just as beautiful here as the seasons were beginning to change than it was during the peak summer season. One thing I want to definitely try to do the next time my grandpa and I visit Rocky Mountain National Park is to actually do the Fall River Road, which I've always known existed and is definitely the precursor to Trail Ridge Road here, of course. It was built at the very beginning of the 20th century and features a lot steeper grades, sharper curves, and is a lot more narrow than Trail Ridge Road. It's definitely more of a nail biter than Trail Ridge Road, that's for sure. but it is only a dirt road, but luckily we drive a Subaru Forester, so I don't think that's going to be any issue whatsoever if we drive the Fall River Road next time we visit Rocky Mountain National Park. And if you guys have driven the Fall River Road, please let me know what your experience was like down in the comments, because I would love to read about your experiences. And if you guys have some other things to check out here in Rocky Mountain National Park that my grandpa and I never stopped at, and when we visited Rocky Mountain National Park here, be sure to let me know down in the comments below, and I'll be sure to take those into consideration the next time we visit Rocky Mountain National Park here in Colorado. Alright everyone, I just want to give a shout out to all my social media accounts that you see on the screen here, because I really am trying to grow my social media accounts beyond just here on YouTube. I would really appreciate it if you guys would check out my Instagram. I'm really trying to grow that social media platform, so I would really appreciate it if you guys would follow me on there. My username is just InterstateKyle. What's really cool about my Instagram is if I'm on a road trip, I will post on my story of where I am and what I'm doing, so it's just a really cool way for you guys to follow along with me in real time to see what I'm doing and what I'm up to. I know my videos on here can get pretty dated very quickly, so if you guys want to see what I'm doing in real time, I highly recommend checking out my Instagram, and I would really appreciate your support over there. You guys can also check out my Facebook group and my Twitter/X account. The links to all those are down in the description. Another thing I want to give a shout out to is my Patreon, which is a way for you guys to support me beyond YouTube here. If you guys want to join my Patreon, you guys can get special perks for joining, like watching all of my videos early before they are released here on YouTube. And all the money I make on there goes right back into this YouTube channel to keep producing more of these types of videos in the future. The link to my Patreon is also down in the description, so if you really want to check it out, I would really appreciate your extra support over there as well. And another thing that is set up on my channel is Super Thanks, which is located to the right of where you would normally like one of my videos. What that basically is just a way for you guys to tip me out for each video going forward if you feel that I've earned it, of course. And then all the money on there also goes right back to this channel to keep producing more of these types of videos in the future. And with all that said, folks, we really hope you all enjoyed riding through Rocky Mountain National Park here in Colorado with us here along Trail Ridge Road. This is certainly one of the most beautiful drives we've ever been on here in the United States, and I just want to thank you all so much for watching this video. We hope you all have an amazing day, and take care, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned to the next adventure, and we will see you next time.